This is Crystal Cole sharing pages 16 through 20 of what teachers need to know about language. And before I get going, I just want to give a shout out to one of the authors, Lily Wong Fillmore from the University of California, Berkeley, my alma mater. And the other author, of course, is Catherine E. Snow. But in researching Lily Wong Fillmore, she has a really interesting story. She's actually from Watsonville, California, which is south of Berkeley. She was educated at Stanford. She is the daughter of American immigrants, and she went through that process of trying to learn English language and found it very frustrating. And that's really where her passion developed, to try to learn more about that process so that she could help other students. She did volunteer as a young woman teaching English in migrant labor camps there. Watsonville, of course, is part kind of bleeding into that area where so much food is grown in the Central Valley of California. As you know, the article sets forth areas that teachers really need to have better education in order to better help ELs. The second area of oral language that we're recommended to learn has to do with understanding what's regular and what isn't, and how do forms relate to each other. So examples are given, and I won't have time in this presentation to go through all the examples. You can look at them on these slides, but it's important just to remember that language irregularities can be confusing, and that's really normal. Of course, as you as an educator really come to understand these patterns, we can all have better empathy and be able to address our EL's questions and anticipate their needs better. Another important thing is to focus on teaching parts of words. Lots of words are learned as we learn parts of words. So by understanding prefixes or other aspects of context, students can learn a lot of words on their own by just understanding those basic patterns. Also, when we're teaching these patterns, and here's an example, one of them that I'm just going to share real quick has to do with accent placement, and the pattern involved around suffixes ending in Y and IC. So the base where there's photograph, the accent is on that first syllable. When we add that Y for photography, now the accent is on that second syllable. When we add IC to give it another nuance of meaning, then the accent is on that third syllable, and that's a pattern we see with other words as well. And so as students are taught what those word endings mean and how these accents relate to that shift in meaning, they can apply that rule over lots of different words. That's that idea of reinforcing patterns more than just throwing lots of words at students. Teachers really need to do a lot of deep understanding with these patterns. Now, a few were described here, but there are many more. Here's another example where Spanish and English cognates can be taught as a rule and then applied by that student in other situations. The third area of oral language that was highlighted has to do with acquiring vocabulary. So how is the lexicon acquired? Lexicon being vocabulary and structured. Oftentimes, the way that we'll teach vocabulary in class can just be so quick and in passing that it's really superficial, and then and can be misleading because it's so superficial. As we teach vocabulary, another important part is to just understand, what does it mean to know a word? What does that mean, right? And it's interesting because sometimes we think that there's just these pairings, but as we kind of come to understand the more subtle elements of language, it can help us as we convey meaning. So how does that word relate to similar forms? And words and concepts, how's it used in grammar, and other questions like that can really help us flesh out what does that mean to actually know a word. Some other great things to have awareness about is just contemplating the idea of how translations can differ, and maybe one translation be a little better because it somehow manages to convey that subtle meaning. Also, just that understanding that a deeper understanding of a word and the meaning it conveys, those subtle aspects of meaning, that ends up being more important than throwing a bunch of words at students. Because as they learn to recognize those language patterns, they can use those and apply those more broadly. When we just hammer them with lots of words, then they're really not learning to fish. Students learn vocabulary best in social conversation and seeing it in text. So if we're just sort of saying words and their meanings in class, that may not be the best way for them to acquire it. Can we give them opportunities to discuss that in a non sort of academic way? But more importantly, can we give them ways that language connects to something they're interested to, where they might actually use that in conversation outside of a classroom setting? That actually tends to be where students are going to be really gaining that knowledge best. As you know, kids acquire vocabulary better in context. So kids are going to learn truck when they're holding their truck, and also things about that, things they care about, and that's intuitive. That if a child sees a garbage truck, that's where they're going to say garbage truck. And my sons were always excited when they came, when they were very little, and lots of vocabulary is used when they're excited like that. English language learners are that same way. And so what we know is that the teacher's big responsibility is to really give that language exposure, that feeling of relevance and excitement, so that the kids can care about it. That ends up being huge in them being able to really acquire that language. The fourth area of our language that was covered has to do with dialects. And this one was really interesting because this actually took place where I was 20 years ago. Well, it was actually about 25 years ago. And while I was at Berkeley. So in terms of dialects, we need to remember that, and especially in the areas that we teach, a lot of us, we serve students from a lot of different backgrounds. And so we really need to understand sociolinguistics and language behavior across cultures. So dialects really are a different sort of way that language is used. It's generally associated with different geographic regions and then also social classes, and that ends up having a lot of weight. What we need to remember, though, is the vernacular dialects are just as regular and standard dialects, and also as useful. English dialects feature contrasting sound systems, grammar, and lexicon or vocabulary. One of the big take-homes from this section is that we as educators really need to uncover our own personal, perhaps misunderstandings or biases with relation to different vernacular dialects, and not in any way allow that to color the way that we judge a student based on intelligence or politeness or friendliness. As we come to better understand language dialects, we can work against those kinds of outcomes where students are often misdiagnosed and misplaced in school simply because of those vernacular dialects. It's vital that schools provide children who speak these varieties of English support to master the English that they will need for jobs. And then I also want to reflect that it's also important to do that in a way that doesn't devalue that dialect for that child. That is the child's home dialect. And we don't want to devalue that for the child, for the student, or for their families or their communities. One of the big examples of this was an incident that took place in 1996. Again, like I said, when I was in Berkeley. Just a little bit south of Berkeley, of course, is Oakland. And Oakland, most years, is considered the most, if not, or one of the most diversified cities in the United States. So reflective of many different cultures. But one of the things that the Oakland School District decided to do was sort of commission some research into how they could improve their students' English scores. And the result was that a lot of the researchers felt that their African American students would benefit from being able to understand their vernacular dialect as almost like a different language, and not necessarily to teach that, but to teach that code switching, and also in doing so validate their language. So I have included some videos that you can look through. Wish we had time to do that, but essentially what I want to say is that it blew up. The news media went crazy, and this was vilified, and a lot of really negative fallout came from misunderstanding and fear. Please take the time to look through these videos. This first one, just the first couple of minutes. But the second video, while not actually depicting Oakland, I think depicts some of those principles really well. And just how ignorance and fear can really cause negative effects in our educational system. Of course, all these years later, we understand that what they were trying to do was fundamentally correct linguistically. A lot of people understood that at the time, but just because public sentiment ran away with that fear and negativity, that it did create lots of problems, and it does have an impact on students. One of the profound quotes at the end of the section was when Lisa Delpit was asked, "What do you think about Ebonics? Are you for it or against it?" And she said, "My answer must be neither. I can be neither for Ebonics nor against Ebonics any more than I can be for or against air. It exists. It is the language spoken by many of our African American children. It is the language they heard as their mothers nursed them and changed their diapers and played peekaboo with them. It is the language through which they first encountered love, nurturance, and joy. On the other hand, most teachers of those African American children who have been least well served by educational systems believed that their students' life chances will be further hampered if they do not learn standard English. In the stratified society in which we live, they are absolutely correct." And while that, for me, is a sad statement, it's also a real statement. And so our mission as educators is to understand dialects, understand their roles, honor them, and not to degrade them at all to students, but instead to help them learn standard English in the context of applying it in the school setting or the job setting, but not to take away from those home dialects. Thanks so much for watching, and thank you.